All right. Well, welcome to the first episode of Everything is a Primary Source, the EPS podcast. I am Eric Paul, and I'm joined today by
Andrew. I'm Eric's coworker
and good friend. And we were just talking about how we had one of these conversations just moments before I hit record on this, in that we have for years now found ourselves just talking about media, a lot of times comic books. That is, I would say that Andrew's background, that's his area of expertise, and that's why I asked him to talk about today's topic. But we can just get going, and I was thinking about this. I'm like, why not just put a microphone in front of us and give somebody the luxury or perhaps the nightmare of listening to us for a solid 90 minutes on a podcast form. So the thrust of this podcast is not necessarily to analyze content of stories or any kind of pop culture, song. I mean, of course, that's going to happen at some point, but just to treat things like movies, songs, magazines, baseball cards, anything as we would a newspaper, a letter, a diary, the traditional primary sources. So today, and a lot of this has to do with another Batman movie coming out very soon. So we're recording this in the fall of 2021, and a trailer has just been released a few weeks ago for The Batman. That is the title, correct? Is The Batman?
Yes, it is.
And so I figured we can start by talking about the 1989 Batman, not The Batman, but just Batman, the movie, by Tim Burton, and having Michael Keaton as the title character, and Bruce Wayne, and of course the other ones will come up too. It's impossible to talk about just one Batman movie because that character has been reintroduced how many times now in movies? I mean,
oh Lord, I mean that's in and of itself is a complex question because do you count the movie serials that were released when the character first emerged? Do you count the campy 1966 Adam West? But at least I'm going to say five, maybe six, kind of relaunches of this character. And that doesn't even include cartoons and all these other media. I fail to see any other character that really has kind of had this continual resurgence as part of American culture. Even beyond Superman, which is kind of odd. Batman just keeps coming up.
And I thought it was just part of the 90s that it was like, who's going to be Batman next? Because how many actors played Batman in the 90s? But then it kept going.
Yeah.
It seemed like in the early 2000s, it was settled. Okay, Christian Bale is Batman, and then Ben Affleck, and now Robert Pattinson. So it just seems to be, I think there's, actually a smaller group of actors in Hollywood that haven't played Batman than have. So the way that we go about this in the style that we analyze, and I didn't invent these questions, for dissection. It's just I kind of tweaked a few of them here and there. But the first question comes up, and we answer these questions for the purpose of saying, what does it tell us about, in this case, the late 1980s in America? How can we use this Hollywood movie, Warner Brothers movie, as a way to say, just like a photograph from 1989 would show us something about the time period, speak to us in the present from the past. So we're just going to go back and forth. When we ask a question and talk about a little bit, we're going to then say, all right, what does it tell us? So the first question is, what material is this made from, and or how was this made? And a lot of times, and it wasn't just till today that I kind of had this eureka moment that, when it comes to the word material, of course, we think of things like physical material. And when it comes to a film, I mean, was it celluloid? It's like, it's hard to say exactly, what the material itself was made from and what that even tells us. There's something to that, but there's also, I thought about it as far as like the material as in like a comedian's material, right? That, you might hear a comedian be like, oh, he ripped off my material. And so in this case, by 1989, the material that Tim Burton was working with was not his own. right? He did not create the character. He was working with a character, like we just said a few minutes ago, had been around for some time. And so, and the 1989 movie, for the casual observer, introduced the first real Dark Knight Batman, and that's something that has not, as far as I can tell, looked back from, since 1989, Batman in the movies has always been wearing black. But had that been going on in the comics for a while by 1989?
No, it by that point in the comics, he was still wearing a kind of gray, what leotard, I guess you'd call it, and the kind of that dark blue cape. It really wasn't until really after the movie that the black started to kind of come into it. If you look at Batman historically, like when he's originally created, they have the cowl and the cape and the boots and stuff are black, when they use blue for kind of like shading to show light and contrast and context. But historically, he was always with the kind of blue cowl, blue underpants, the giant yellow belt, and blue accents. And that pretty much holds true. And like, I wouldn't consider myself the world's, first and foremost Batman, expert, but at least from my perspective, from my experience, it wasn't until well after the movie that Batman started to be, kind of black and gray, or just, a costume of total black. Really, like the first that I remember of it was just prior to 1986. Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns came out, and a big moment. I don't want to take time to overanalyze that, which I could do 7 podcasts about. But a big story point is where Batman's costume shifts from the traditional blue, gray, and yellow to black and gray, where literally the yellow symbol that's around his bat disappears, and then there's just a black bat against his chest, and it's to represent, at least how I interpret it, that this shift in tone of the character. It literally becomes darker, and kind of contrasted against Superman. And I think that definitely influenced this movie. Obviously, this is not The Dark Knight Returns. There's several key differences, but I think that kind of gritty tone influenced this movie, and Tim Burton's vision for it.
So I remember watching reruns of the Adam West one, and Gotham City was the brightest, most welcoming city, because they were just filming, I'm sure, somewhere in probably in LA.
In no way was it the Warner Brothers backlot, just
right,
dressed up with Gotham.
And so this movie was dark in tone, dark in Batman's costume, dark in the fact that he was doing things that, at least on the screen, again, the comics totally different, but he was behaving as Batman much differently. So really the material that it's made from, all those previous Batmans, the actual movie itself doesn't take on much more of those, other than like character names and settings. It doesn't, it kind of
like character names,
own
basic settings, basic design. But I think tonally, in terms of not only the story, the characters, the set design, I think has much more to do with Tim Burton and the late 1980s. I actually had a great conversation about how, you look at Superman the movie, and it's just a light and hopeful movie, which it makes sense for the characters. But if you look at Batman, what's funny is you see a trend that's created with 1989 Batman, that I as much as like Superman the movie just like enthralled people and lived, like what was the tagline, like you'll believe a man can fly. Batman the movie, what was really cool was, if you look at all the superhero content that came out, the DC stuff, it all kind of takes a similar aesthetic, where there's like a weird out of time Art Deco nature to it. Like I remember in like 1991, and you'll have to fact check me on this, there was a Flash TV series on
I remember that show.
I went nuts for it. And watching it now, because I of course own it, they took that Art Deco, it looks like almost a Victorian view of the future, and just transposed it into the Flash world, where like everything's dark and has like is it the 1950s, is it 1930s, is it 1990s? I don't know. I remember like almost all the characters drove like Studebakers, 1950s squad cars.
I remember that. I remember watching that and commenting about that with the police cars in particular, and how I was like, what era is this? And by doing that, and even with the 1989 Batman movie, like Commissioner Gordon, for example, comes out very much like a holdover from the 60s.
Yeah.
Whereas some of the other characters like Harvey Dent in that is very modern, and it's so,
again, like you see elements of that late 80s progressive nature where we're going to do Billy D. Williams as Harvey Dent. There's kind of like a modern art take on it, like with the art, the whole scene in the art gallery, that. But you're right, like it really is like they took all these historical elements and jammed them together. It's funny you mentioned Gordon, because I think that actor's name is Pat Hingle.
It is, yep.
And his career, he's a great character actor who has played a lot of bad guys, and in that he is like, he's I'm not gonna say he's bumbling, but I don't get a lot of like cop from him.
Yeah.
If you look at Commissioner Gordon in all the later, or outside of that Bat universe, like the Batman the Animated Series, the new movies, they always kind of approach Gordon like he's the ultimate cop, and if Batman weren't around, he would be the greatest detective in Gotham City. It's just he lacks the technological resources to follow through. But in that, he really is just like, I don't know, like a little bit sterner version of the 1966 Batman Commissioner Gordon, where it's just like he's like, oh, Batman, just kind of like accepting of this. Even when Batman's a criminal, it's kind of like just like reacting to him, and never, I don't know, trying to do anything or seeing things from a Law and Order perspective, which is just interesting that the police are almost just kind of like set dressing.
They are.
It's just interesting. Is that commentary on the police?
Especially, well, and I think that's a perfect chance to cross over to the other side of the analysis here. And, you touched on it also with, how is this made? Every movie is made with a script, actors, director. I mean, they couldn't have made the movie without any of those things, of course. If you really want to know how a movie's made, watch the credits. That explains everything you need to know. But what does this all say about 1980s America? So like you hit on it so well, a few minutes ago by saying it's a direct reflection of the era. Urban decay, the cities, the inner cities had really suffered a lot throughout the 1980s. A lot of federal funding was cut. Social programs were, eaten away at. There was, people leaving the cities in droves, and it was, a lot of American cities were, I remember being a kid and going to New York City in the late 80s, and my grandmother, who lived very close by, and she would take us into the city. We would be on the bus, and she'd have us close our eyes for most of the bus ride, because it was just so, there's so many things out the window that she did not want us to see. So having Batman, and I like that you brought up, by this point we're police officers like window dressing, in modern American cities.
Well, I think in the 80s, it's such a weird time, because there's so many, like, mass media is enabling these conversations about, social welfare, about policing and things like that. And so I feel like we reached a point where the country had changed so much that we could not go on the way we had done things, but we didn't know a path forward. You look at the media from the previous decade, the 70s, where there's an acknowledgement of the grittiness, the lawlessness, the violence, but there's kind of like just a unifying message, right? This is the era that gave birth to Dirty Harry, like all those great cop movies, like The French Connection. Whereas you got to the 80s, and we see Ronald Reagan, take the presidency, and there's a sense of a strong leader and tough on crime. But for all of that, there's also, like that gives rise to anti-drug education, and this idea that mental health played some role in this. I feel like Batman 1989 is, at least in part, kind of given birth to that, because we didn't really have an answer. Like, you look at the Joker, and there's some question is like, why is he the way he is? He's not just like some sinister evil, right? Is this because of trauma in this film? Of course, is this because of trauma? What happened to him? It's just he's a bad guy, and this has further enabled him. And I think it just kind of marks that beginning of, like Batman is the solution because he is not part of the system.
Not to mention, of course, the poisonous pollution component to it, or maybe not even pollution, but some kind of chemistry type accident where there's this toxic sludge that he falls into, and it's in some chemical plant, and he was already an awful person. He's a gangster, he's a hitman, he's already terrible, but then he is even more maniacal because of the environmental hazards that anybody could have fallen into that, but it just made him worse.
Not to interrupt you, sorry, but I think there's even a parallel to be drawn with the in 1980s anti-drug crusade. I don't think they were in a movie where kids are going to be the target audience. I don't think they, at that point in American history, they were going to just address the drug epidemic. But if you look at like the Joker's poison and what it really does, I think there's an analogy to be made there about the drugs were flooding these cities and turning kids, at least in the minds of American suburban families, that these things are just turning kids into these evil, maniacal villains, kind of like the Joker, kind of simplifying that. Like you look at media now, and they talk about these things in maybe not children's programming, but in stuff that young adults are going to watch or consume, that they directly address this. Maybe that's part of the DARE program or a shift. I think that definitely having kind of a pseudo stand-in for all of America's problems as it relates to crime was part of their agenda.
Yeah, I mean, and just as much as Batman's been reintroduced so many times over the last 30 years, so has the Joker. And we could definitely do more on that. And like you said, 7 podcasts at least just about these.
Yeah,
these
you
things.
just sit and talk about this endlessly.
The next 2 questions that come up are who made it and what was the maker's role or status in society. We could probably take care of that all in one fell swoop. When it comes to Batman, again, the maker of the movie is a countless number of people, from the actors, the writer, the producers, everybody from the key grip to the best boy, that's who makes a movie. But the director, I think, when I'm working on this in my classes, I always say, for a movie, ultimately the director is the one that, I guess you could say producer, but we're going to say just Tim Burton is the maker of it this time. And I just want to talk briefly about where you consider his career as of, late 1980s, because it's funny now when you think of Tim Burton, there's this Burton-esque, and that's why A Nightmare Before Christmas, he really didn't have much involvement with that, but they still called it Tim Burton's A Nightmare Before Christmas because he had just catapulted to popularity between Batman and just before that Beetlejuice. And it's just a funny thing how in that time period his status within filmmaking might have been one thing, and now it's just anything with black and white stripes and but
I think our much like a lot of those directors, you think it's some of the name directors now, where it's not just like someone who really is talented, but who is like one of those key names. You think of like Tarantino and Scorsese and maybe Wes Anderson. I think that there's this tendency to boil them down to their basic elements. Like Scorsese is local crime and character drama. Tarantino is also crime, but in a much more abstract. And I think like with Tim Burton, you think of that basic aesthetic, and basic story types. Maybe like you think of depth or the kind of recurring characters. But I think that like when you look at Beetlejuice and Batman and even Batman Returns to some extent, and some of his early stuff, you see kind of the creation of this aesthetic dream. I actually have somewhere I think I found on YouTube, and I found an old DVD with a copy on it. There was a pre-film release documentary about this movie that I'll send along to you at some point, where they interview Bob Kane and they get to tour the set. And I think it was originally released maybe on like HBO or something like that as a draw for their paid subscribers. And they actually talk about like Tim Burton's re-envisioning of Gotham City, that it like he literally made this sprawling Gotham, like actually after its namesake, where it's all these different aesthetics and styles and architectures that you could like kind of took elements from all those dark periods in human history, but you couldn't like put a time period or name on it. And that really kind of begins Tim Burton's aesthetic. Like he and I'm guessing his director of cinematography and stuff like that. And again, I'm not the pure expert on this film, but I think that kind of gives birth to his creative vision. That I think some people have like The Nightmare Before Christmas. I don't know what his total involvement with that is. Like, what did he give feedback about the aesthetic, or was this just like, oh, this is a Tim Burton aesthetic, and he's attached as producer?
Yeah, I mean, because it was his idea early on. That movie was, and he had done some shorts with it and some, back when he was still working for Disney. That's where it all got started. But because he's so busy with other projects, when that got greenlit, they actually had to Burton up the character designs. So when they were, and that's what they called it, when the creative staff was doing that. And I think that really answers this question. By 1989, I mean, he had as his resume so far by that point, like I said, Beetlejuice, Pee-wee's Big Adventure. He had done some shorts like Frankenweenie, with when he was still at Disney, a few other things. And so, his status in society, it wasn't like people would see him walking down the street and be like, oh, look at this Tim Burton, he's, the king. But just filmmaker by 1989, somebody who is making films and wide release pictures at that has, like you said, you put him in this, we can put him on a list of probably 10 directors that all you have to do is use their last name, and people know the kind of movie you're talking about.
They get instant vision of that.
Yeah, it's like Spielberg, Scorsese, like you said, Tarantino. So he is becoming a household name, and I think that also is very reflective of 1980s America. That we had become such a, and we still are, if not more so, a leisure class society where entertainment gets just as much of our attention as anything else. And so if somebody is good at entertaining, if they are bringing new ideas, they're creative, they're inventive, they're all innovative with, in this case, film, then they're going to make a documentary, like you said, even before the movie comes out. Not every movie comes complete with a documentary as part of its marketing campaign. But this one did, because they knew that this guy was, and throughout the 1980s, and especially as you get closer to 89 into 90, the 80s really picked up on, and I think that punk rock in the 70s had a lot to do with this, of that do-it-yourself attitude, that if you want to be a musician, in the case of rock and roll, then just do it. Make your own magazines to promote yourself, make your own flyers, set up your own shows, whatever. And that bled first, I think, into comics, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Mirage Studios was made in a pizza parlor, like they just said, we're going to make it here. And they went from, and then because of the time period, just picked right up. Something new and fresh gets just picked up by this huge current of the entertainment, consumer. The people are like, oh, that's great, I want that. And it's very telling of the time period that you have somebody, in this case in film, who, even before he had lots of, multi-million-dollar budget to make a movie, he was still wanting to just do what he could with what he had. as
Yeah.
kind of junior animator at Disney. And then by the end of the decade, because it's an era that embraces innovation, it embraces, and really like holds people up high that are good at their individual talents, where he's going to be celebrated,
Yeah.
especially in that era.
Well, I think that, Batman 1989 came at it was almost a perfect chain of events. So you've got 1986, that's The Dark Knight Return comes out, which completely just shatters anything that was done with Batman before. Like no one had ever seen anything like that before. It really embraces that dark, gritty vision where America could go. That Batman becomes biting social commentary again. Not to discount the years of Batman, Neil Adams and stuff like that, or Dennis Cowan, and that stuff that came before. But Dark Knight Returns had done stuff different for comics fans. But the 80s, if you think about it, the 80s is where like that media consumer idea on a personal basis comes in, because like we've got the rise of VHS, where movies can be in the home and you can experience them on a level that you could never before.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the 70s, we start to see that, but I wouldn't say it becomes common where like network TV and broadcast TV were big in the 70s, and you get the rise of pay channels like HBO. But it's not until the later half of the 80s when VHS becomes so widespread. I remember my copy of Batman 1989, along with there's probably like 5 movies. Like I had Ninja Turtles that I just wore them to pieces. And Batman 1989 began with a Bugs Bunny infomercial for Batman 1989 products.
Yeah.
And the Batman 1989 VHS you're actually watching was
one of the
on the VHS.
Yeah.
And I think that, that's a big part of it, that you have this kind of do-it-yourself mentality where we have the rise of Mirage Studios. You've got these indie creators who are doing their own thing, Art Spiegelman, Mouse, all that stuff. And I think it hit at the exact right time where the consumers would have access to that. There wasn't that gateholder or gatekeeper. Like I think Ninja Turtles was great for you to bring up, because that's a perfect example of, on paper, that should not work, right? Yeah. Like if you look at Hollywood, you look at comics prior to that point, only what get will work is what's going to get published on a mass scale where everyone has a chance to see it. And Ninja Turtles just hit. Copies of it came out at various cons, and people just kind of went nuts for it. And it just kind of became this whole other thing. And I think Batman 1989 also capitalized off of that, where, like you have at that point, like 40 years of Batman, at least people who are familiar with the Batman character
mm-hmm.
are now able to not only go to theaters to see this, but also purchase it and watch it at home, and also look at all the other media that came out with it. Video games and cereals.
Oh yes, yeah.
Toys. Like the 80s is the era of that mass marketplace. I talk about this all the time, that like I love comics now, but I also hate it because like with the MCU and everything is monetized. But I think really that gets fired up in the 80s for comics and those properties.
Yeah, I mean, and incidentally, and it should be pointed out, we're recording this from New Hampshire, so we have a special place in our heart for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, considering Absolutely. They were, designed initially in Dover, New Hampshire, and so there's special affinity here. But I mean, it's lightning fast how quickly that goes from print to movie, and in between there, toys, video games, the whole, television show, of course, other comics, 5 years. I mean, from the first printing to movies. I mean, that's so fast. Batman obviously took, closer to 40 years. And I think that's part of the reason why the next question is, why did they make it? So the question is, why did, of all the times, why not 1979 when the Superman movies are coming out? Why not introduce Batman then? Did it not just fit the interest of it? Or why not earlier in the Batman's, what they did make a Batman movie with Adam West.
Yep.
That should be pointed out.
Serials that came out originally.
Exactly. And those I think always just aesthetically looked really cool.
They look cool. They look cool. But again, that I think with those, there's also a do-it-yourself. We don't really respect the medium, but we know it's going to make us money attitude.
Yeah.
Like, I remember as a kid, my parents, the Sci-Fi Channel would always run the old Superman serials and the Batman serials, and I love the Superman ones. But the Batman ones, there was something about them always threw me, just because you can tell, just like his cowl was just some felt,
Yeah.
and his horn, his horns, but his ears are always slightly askew. And as a kid, I was like, well, what? I don't understand. But I'm sure for the kids, when that came out in the 40s, it was probably the same way we felt, but it was kids. And as you were just talking, I was thinking about that. I think another contributing factor is 1980s is the rise of the direct market comic shop, where we actually get mass distributors of comics and a specialized place you can go to buy them. Because prior to that, comics were in supermarkets and convenience stores and things like that, or mail order. And a comic would be picked up if it sold.
Right.
And so I remember the general store in my town, going in there and going directly to the magazine rack. And they had a little comics rack, and always being, you never knew what was going to be in there, because it was based on what sold and what the 45-year-old store owner wanted to purchase ahead of time. Whereas, they could return it to the comic companies at that point. If they didn't sell it, you return it and then pick up a out of the will. The direct comic market was much more broad, and I think capitalized on 1980s nostalgia and all these things. And I think it was just a perfect confluence of events.
No, that's a perfect answer to that question. Why did they make it? Because he is on the pantheon of comic book characters. Batman is up there. He's up there with Superman. He's up there with Spider-Man, and all the rest. So of course, if you can make a movie and everyone else is making, because the Turtles were in production during this time. Yeah. And they had already become, well known in the comics world and beyond. So of course, Warner Brothers and DC Comics, right? We got to do a Batman movie, and given the limitations, so technology and movie making was getting better.
Yeah.
But it wasn't quite where it needed to be to do, say, a Spider-Man movie or a really convincing Superman movie. Where it looks like he flies, but Batman, who doesn't have any superpowers, he just has gadgets. I think that's another reason why it was made when it was. They said we could do a real Batman. It looks like, because like you said, in the 1970s, Superman, you will believe a man can fly. Well, there's no belief. There's no suspension of belief. Like, you believe a man can put on an outfit like a bat. Like, of course, it's not hard to do. So, the why they made it, and you said it so well, and how it's a reflection of 1980s America, is that, it's a capitalistic society at that time, very much centered in on investment and return. And, all these other comic properties had proven to be very, very good. And so, well, why not Batman? And so let's get this young, director with all these great ideas, very innovative, take a classic character, update it. I mean, I don't think it's any coincidence that the poster and the movie box, and it's just a very simple, bat symbol, but it's shiny, right? Yeah. It has that nice, glow to it. Whereas the opening sequence for the, where you're going through a cavern, like a big canyon that eventually turns out to be the Batman. I remember watching it as a kid, like, so where in Gotham City is that? Is it on the outskirts?
Where's the giant bat symbol in the ground?
Like, these people should, of course he's a Batman, and I should also point out the same grandmother that I used to visit, because she lived, outside New York. When this movie was coming out, part of the promotion was the T-shirts, with just a simple bat symbol. And she asked us, she's like, why are all these teenagers wearing shirts with teeth on it? And I was like, what? And then she's like, oh, because then you look at it, it's like one of those drawings where if you look at it one way, it's, you can see. And I was like, oh no, that's Batman, Grandma. That,
it's the use of negative space.
Yeah. And
which I'd like to research. Maybe I'll do that after this. Just research more about, the marketing people for this were brilliant. Just brilliant in terms of that basic design and what they're going to sell it on. It is almost so simple, it's deceptive.
Mhm.
and just iconic. And that's, you know, again, as you were talking, I always do this where I start to just like think about what you're talking about and kind of where I'm going to jump off of. And I was thinking about like, you know, part of it is they made this now because they can, right? Like they can feasibly do this, and they have people who are willing to put enough money so that it doesn't look goofy. Like you look at the 1966 Batman, you know, you have the Lincoln Futura car, which is amazing. It's my favorite Batmobile, which I know is like controversial for some people. But the rest of it is done largely on a shoestring budget, like just slapping some bat symbols on things
Yeah.
and having bat-shaped handcuffs. But if you wanted to do this right, you'd have to do exactly what they did. And I don't think studios, you know, like even Superman, the majority of the money for that had to go into just the filming technology for how to make it look as if he's flying. Because the rest of it, you look at Superman, it's largely filmed like a 1970s crime flick. You know, I remember the first scenes in that when he's catching the bad guys. When he first shows up, he helps land the plane and catches the bad guy. And just I watched it maybe a year or two ago, and I just had this funny moment. I was like, wow, this is like aesthetically, if you took out the dude with the cape, there's not much separating this from a movie like The French Connection. Like,
Yeah.
The aesthetics and the character types and even the character actors they pick. You know, I'm like there's the scene when you know, like a cop goes into his station and he's like, oh, you was wearing little red boots. And they're like, all right, let's go take you across the street to get a beer. Yeah. And they go outside. There's just a yacht in the center of the road. Like, if you take out the fantastic elements, it really isn't that much different than every other 70s movie that came out. Whereas Batman, aesthetically, in terms of like just production value, was unlike anything I had ever seen.
I mean, it was very noir, and I'm sure I've
exactly
mispronounced that, but
they didn't just set on the Warner Brothers lot with just, you know, a couple aesthetic changes.
Yeah.
You know, they did with the Batman 1966. They built Gotham City with all of these stylistic, you know, little nods and things like that. I remember the scene in it when they're having a press conference outside. The scene when you know, Joker shows up and he's in a tuxedo and he throws the quill pen. And I remember just looking at that, like, just look at that scene, the set design there. You're like, wow. Like even movies today, like I watched the regrettable Ben Affleck Daredevil, which I have a love for because I love Daredevil, but I watched that and like, it's supposed to be in New York, but it is plainly obvious they filmed it in LA. I think they come out of the district courthouse, and it's clearly the LA County Courthouse, which has been in countless TV shows.
Yeah.
Movies. They just weren't willing to spend the money to either film in New York or find someplace or design someplace that had that New York aesthetic. Whereas 1989 Batman, they absolutely took your grandmother's nightmare vision of what New York actually was that you hid your eyes from and just like gave it life. I would argue the top billing for that movie, like Michael Keaton, Jack Nicholson, and Gotham should be the top billing because Gotham is a character in that.
And it's, you know, and that brings us to the next, so there is another question that says, where was it made? And you say I mean, you're like ahead of me on each one. It's perfect.
Sorry.
No, don't apologize. This is perfect because this proves that this way of analysis works so well. Yeah. You know, where was it made? You know, it's not an actual place. You know, you can't go visit. And even subsequent Batman movies have kind of just mashed together cities to, you know, I think they even went kind of over the top as the 90s went on with some of the you know, with the way Gotham was, like, it was always nighttime, and you know, is that a building, is that a sculpture, is that, you know, both, you know, what are we dealing with here? And you know, to bring it back with, you know, what does this tell you about a 1980s America? You know, part of it is that, especially at the end of the 80s, we were approaching the end of not only the decade, but also the century and the millennium. And for almost every other decade of the 20th century leading up to the 80s, it was sort of like everything was a reflection of what came before it. But right around the time where we get from that turn from the 80s to the 90s, subconsciously, or even just actually saying out loud, this is the last 10 years of this century. So the year 2000 loomed really large. And it, in some ways, and we can, you know, definitely with the legacy of this movie, it was like, all right, no more, you know, spandex Batman. This is Batman. You know, no more everything else that came before it is done now. This is now the new standard for Batman going into the 21st century. You
Mm.
know, so where it was made and how does that reflect that same idea? You know, like you said, they invented Gotham City, and it was therefore kind of everybody understood it as it could be like kind of like a post-apocalyptic, because the year 2000 means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, throughout the 20th,
and a lot of different times.
right? Like earlier in the 20th century, it's a promise. It's like we're gonna have utopia by 2000, and even just before this came out with the Back to the Future Part 2, they envisioned a 2015 of flying cars, and everybody having just an easygoing, everything is just made for for ease and so forth. And whereas this is a much darker kind of vision of the present, but also what is to come.
Well, I think it's almost a meeting of the past, the present, and a possible future for us. I always think of like Blade Runner. I think is a perfect set piece. Like you look at Blade Runner and you see this mashing together of cultures, and you see that cyberpunk idea of like high tech, low life, that our technology will continue to develop, but we will remain the same. That it'll enable our already existing personality types, that like you can have all this great tech, but the same like crappy people are going to be even made more crappy by the fact they have new technological abilities. And so I like Batman because it does feel like Victorian England and that Jack the Ripper aesthetic, but it also feels like 1950s and 1980s, and this kind of like hint of the future that would come with like, I remember the role TV played in that. Like if you think about like the role TV play where it's almost like a narrator at certain points for us, where it kind of like gives us plot points, but is in everyone's life, which by the way, Frank Miller absolutely did in The Dark Knight Returns. He has whole pages of just talking heads on TV that act as narrators, act as, almost a counterpoint to Batman, or even it's sometimes like asking questions for us. And I don't think maybe the TV in this takes on that big a role, but it to me always felt futuristic.
Yeah.
Like that there's all this stuff going on and everyone is connected via TV. And you literally get to see those comedic moments where no one is using personal care products, and you actually see the TV anchors just look horrible on camera because they're afraid of getting poisoned. I thought there was something interesting.
Well, I mean, it's about, technology playing a role in controlling people's lives.
Yep.
Because, Joker takes his, attempt to take over the city starts on TV, with his takeover of the TV station. And, nobody even questions how he does it, or he's able to even push away.
Exactly.
And I just made a hand motion on audio, but he pushes away the other existing what's on the TV, and nobody, it's like his crew consists of him and Bob and a bunch of other guys, and it's like
Nameless
which one of these is the tech guy that's able to master. But they never question it, because if this is in the not so distant future, well, everyone can hack into this stuff. It's not, it's just a part of it.
I think even Batman's always been about the stuff, right? The Batmobile, the Batcopter, the Bat whatever. And to some degree that was made, I mean, not even some degree, that was made fun of with the 1966 Batman. But I look at this as the first year where, I don't know, it's almost as if the characters are in on the jokes. I mean, literally, what's the line that everybody remembers to the Joker? Where does he get these wonderful toys?
Yeah.
I think like you fast forward ahead, look at the Ben Affleck Batman in the Justice League movie. They literally write a line in. They're like, "Oh, like what's your superpower again?" He's like, "I'm rich," and he just. I think that
which is funny, because one of the best references to that, the Joker line from this movie is in Mallrats, which Ben Affleck is in Mallrats as the one of the guys that is the big baddie.
He is one of the two bad guys in that film.
So speaking of which, and I think this might, I'm ahead of it in this one. The next question, and we're down to, and actually the one after this, I think we can probably just kind of summarize, because we've hit on it so much already. But this next one is, who is the intended audience or user of this? So in 1989, obviously, this was not a Batman for the kids who had been watching it on Saturday mornings. It wasn't for the older generation either. I remember my dad saying how much he disliked it because he had grown up when he was a teenager with the campy 1960s one.
Yep.
He didn't. I think he actually liked this one a little bit better than the Christian Bale ones, but he's like, that's not, Batman.
For their, their generation came of age during the Comics Code, which was designed. I mean, it's designed by comics companies to keep comics in print, but if you look at what it does to comics, it completely makes them toothless. Like when Batman's created, A, he has guns, but B, he is a social justice crusader who is violent, right? Superman was as well. Like you go back and look at the Superman comics in the 40s, they are not apple pie, eagle on my shoulder America. Mm-hmm. There's like, he is always fighting, corrupt politicians and gangsters and people who preyed on the average American worker. And so your dad's generation, my dad's generation, were brought up where Batman is this wholesome, character who he does fight the Joker. And in the 70s and 80s, we see a little bit more kind of sharp edge to that. But largely, it's kind of toothless. And I think the 1966 Batman was in part making fun of that, but also leaning into it in a certain way. And our generation, whether it's because of what was going on or maybe the comics code was dying. I want to say there's a 1985 revision to the comics code. It is like a last ditch effort to kind of keep control over that. But this movie was made squarely for you and me and the kids who grow up in the decaying America of the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
But it embodied all the things we were afraid of.
And it has all the elements that a teenager and young adult would go to the movies for in the 1980s to see.
Yes.
Because Batman, like you said, is very violent in this movie. He doesn't have a code of conduct like earlier and later Batmans do of no killing. I mean, he easily kills, the Joker's henchmen without even thinking about it.
There's a whole scene. If you look at the Batmobile, he literally there's a scene where he's invading Ace Chemical. Panels pop out of the top, and 2 Browning machine guns just like annihilate.
Open up, yeah.
Being shot down, but like the Batman would use guns. What for the comics is a no-no, and then he literally like drops a bomb and blows the building up. And again, like they don't show anyone dying, but like the Death Star, I think we have to assume that some people either got an ouchie or just died.
And it's, I mean, so that is enough to keep the teenager in the 80s satisfied, right? They want that. It's all the other movies that they were seeing at the time, same thing. And so I mean, that tells you not only what was going on in other media and in what they're in the music, in the artwork and all these other things, but also if you're aiming a movie at that any demographic, it indicates that they have either their own money or access to it and time, and access to time. And so when these movies come out, this was a summertime movie, if I'm not mistaken. And, so many other blockbusters are, when the target audience, they might have a 4-hour shift at the mall at their job, and they get to keep all their own money from that. They don't have bills and things to pay. They just go and see the movie that they want to see with their friends. And, this is going to keep them maybe even coming back to see it a couple times. Nice PG-13 rating tells them that it's they can get into it, right? They can actually physically go buy a ticket for it. But
it's edgy enough where there's a limit.
Right. There's, you're not going to see 6-year-olds in there, either. So it's very telling of, we've talked a lot about like pushing boundaries today and like living on the edge of things. And I think that even with the intended audience, definitely speaks to that of the 80s. Now, the last question that I use, like I said, ideas and behavior, does this convey? I think we already stated that throughout the last hour or so of our conversation. So, we don't need to do it all over again, but what this tells you again about 1980s America, late 80s, and I would go so far as saying it's true for pretty much any era in American creativity, and that is, this concept of self-expression, that if you have, something to say it. And
Yeah.
the vehicle that's used in both, directly and indirectly with Batman, because he does have several vehicles, but the vehicle that Tim Burton uses, and in this case would be, through the character of Batman. And Burton has a lot of commentary in a lot of his movies. I mean, some more subtle than others.
Yeah.
I think about Edward Scissorhands and its commentary on conformity, and, with the suburbs, and, again, another movie of his that it's really hard to pin down exactly what time period it is, because he's saying there are some things that are universal, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, or Warner Brothers. But, so he has all those things that I think the ideas are there, and the behavior is, once again, if you have, something to say, to put it into a creative, and you are a creative person,
Yeah.
that's to be encouraged, that we're not to
Yeah.
discourage creative people from expressing themselves that way. And, again, that matches up. But, Batman is not a local folklore story. It's not something that's just, reserved to, like Appalachia, the Batman, comes out at night. It's nationally known, it's internationally known by this point. Everybody knows
Yeah.
about Batman. And, you don't need to explain it to anybody. I love that about the movie, that, this version of it doesn't really give an origin story. Just, he shows up.
Yeah,
And,
we get that iconic flashback scene with the pearls and everything, which had been part of Batman's entire origin for years, but we
yeah.
don't get an explicit like Christian Bale's Batman, where we literally walk through the origin of this character.
But at least we get that in the title, so we know it's coming. It's not like,
Exactly.
we
And
have
that's
to
what
spend the first.
and I prefer, as much as I love a good origin story, I think with Batman, we've all seen it so much. I like that this movie just literally throws us right into bat. Like we don't see him train, we don't see him building the Batcave or anything like that. And I kind of like it. I love the. This is my favorite I have to preface this with saying this is my favorite Batman movie. I acknowledge that the Nolan Batman movies are much more complex and have all sorts of things to say, but this was my favorite one because I grew up on it. But just the choice to have Michael Keaton as Batman is such a I remember this was one of the first examples of fan outrage, that people were freaking out over this, that how dare they take this pseudo edgy comedic actor from the 80s and make him Batman. And thank God there wasn't an internet back then, because
Right.
I think Ben Affleck, he would have been
Mr. Mom.
excoriated. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that self-expression thing, I think it's all part of Tim Burton's vision. That if you look at Michael Keaton's version of this character, he looks like, maybe he's not like physically imposing, and they didn't have him take a regimen of working out, so he has 42 ab muscles. But you look at him, and I think everything lands the fact that Michael Keaton has such an energy that he looks like he could be just crazy enough to throw on a rubber bat suit and pummel people at night. And I think that's all part of this vision that only came about because of that time period, that do it yourself, go out there and realize your vision. And for the first time, at least in my memory, the first time that a major studio is just going to let that happen. You look at, even now, I look at the DC movies that are coming out now, and there's a huge amount of studio pressure and power. And now we have this fan backlash where we're getting, the Snyder cut, and now they're talking about the Ayer cut for the original Suicide Squad and things like that. And I think that the 80s were the first and maybe the last time that they were just going to not think about that and then let Tim Burton have his vision. And I think that speaks to the quality of the film and the time period in which it came out.
Yeah, and it's something that goes away quickly,
Yeah.
for that particular
Yes.
character and that property, because it just gets eaten up by the
money and toys
and so, and when he did his sequel to it, it was continuing what he had started with the first one. And by that point, the merchandising component was like, oh, wait a minute,
Yeah, there were like
he's still being
McDonald's
Tim Burton,
toys.
right? And they had to
Yeah,
pull those because they were so disturbing. The movie was disturbing.
yeah,
They couldn't have it. So Tim Burton he's like, I'm going to keep, they're like, oh, you're going to keep being Tim Burton. I see. You're not
yeah.
conforming to what we want.
And then we
And
get the sequels, which are toothless and ridiculous and
right. And
whatever.
so
I went to see them both, and they both,
yeah,
talk about the effects of Tim Burton. Look at the city's aesthetic in the Val Kilmer Batman, Batman Forever, and then Batman Robin. It's still there, but to this almost amplified degree because it's someone who doesn't totally understand it.
right. They took it.
There's a scene in Batman Robin where they're like driving across these huge statues, like these men with hammers. And
yeah,
they're driving the Batmobile along these statues. And even as at that point, I was a teenager, but I was watching that being like, this has gotten out of hand. Like,
it has. I was
that big in the middle of the city.
I started getting very depressed in the first opening sequence of Batman Forever for the same reason. I'm like, what is going on here? How's this gotten to?
It's totally so
confronts
weird.
a gang, a street gang that's like all neoned out and black lights
Yeah.
and stuff like that. I'm like, as if that's it gone way too out of hand.
But like, I think Batman Returns, for all its marketing nonsense, if you get to the heart of that, it's still part of this vision. I remember seeing an interview with Tim Burton someplace, and he talked about Michael Keaton's performance in that is really nuanced because it is a direct flow out of this movie where at the end, spoiler alert, Jack Nicholson's Joker dies, and he is at the origin. He's the core of why Michael Keaton's Batman is Batman. And so if you look at him in Batman Returns, he's kind of flailing about because he really doesn't have any reason to be Batman anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, he's doing it nightly because it's just kind of what he does, but he's literally avenged his parents' death. And now he's like, well, what now?
I'll just keep it up.
Kind of giving him, like a future or something beyond this.
The last question on any of these things is this prescriptive or descriptive? And of course, the way to differentiate between the two is that descriptive is just describing something, and prescriptive makes you obviously want to think about something, or you do something specific with it. And I think we covered it very well as far as what Tim Burton wants you to walk away with after watching this movie.
Yeah.
But going back to a component we said before about the audience, and this also goes to the legacy of it. I think when people, and I eventually did get my Batman shirt in that time period. I was probably like 9 or 10 years old when I finally got it, and it wasn't the black and yellow one. Mine was, I think, like a purple and green. It was pretty cool, but it was like a badge of honor that you would wear it around, and it would indicate to people not that you had been interested in this character since his inception, but that you had lined yourself up with the 1989 gritty, noir, cool, Dark Knight Batman who is terrorizing criminals and being just awesome in every way possible. And it was pretty badass, and that's what you would... and
like reflective of the teenage aesthetic, like covered in darkness and angsty, and there's whole scenes in that, think about it, like where Keaton is just like angstily just kind of looking off in the distance and feeling emotions, like the scene where Joker challenges him to a duel on TV, and you see him just kind of watching the street, closes his glass and just sits there and looks. I think it was part of that teenage time period. It was a badge. I didn't, unfortunately, my parents were, they were not young. And so I don't think they were maybe as aware of that stuff. So they didn't really get on the bandwagon of like, oh, superheroes for kids, at least new superhero stuff. Like I'd always had, I remember as a kid watching the Adam West Batman with my dad, like eating TV dinners when it was his night to cook and my mother was working. But I didn't really get that stuff until I saw Batman Returns in theaters. My dad took me and did not want to go in with me, which I guess that's probably in common with your dad. But I didn't get really the material goods until like my parents acknowledged it, but also didn't want to spend the money. And so my mother would like make me, Flash t-shirts. I remember for my birthday, we got like a painting party, and she made me like a Flash hoodie with the symbols on the ears and the chest. And I was like, oh my God, I'm finally in.
Right.
I'm
that's how
not
you
just wearing
proved
hand me
it.
downs.
And
I think for our generation, I'm just a weird outlier in that because of just who my parents were. That for the rest of us, you're absolutely right that having the Batman poster on your wall or the T-shirt or any of those things, you were part of that culture. Kind of like punk rock. I guess like kind of like how punk rock hit the suburban American kids. Like,
yeah.
okay, like you're wearing the leather jacket, you're in.
And
Or
all those bands had their own,
yeah, their own
symbol,
thing.
not terribly different from the Batman logo,
Yeah.
that you would be able to kind of like size up with each other, like where you line up and where you match up on your interests.
Yeah.
And that has definitely not gone away. If anything, it's become
No.
accelerated thanks to the internet. And so, and especially the more obscure your t-shirt might be is assigned to others that or sticker or whatever's on your coffee cup or on your laptop is a way to communicate to other people what you're interested in, and hey, maybe we have something in common before
Yeah.
we even start talking to one another and making a podcast on primary sources. So it's another reflection of the era that these kinds of things, the way that people, I mean, it'd been a long time by that point that it was perfectly acceptable to wear in most public school settings, for example, a t-shirt and jeans,
Yeah.
to school. And you would emblazon on your shirt whatever you were interested in, whether it's a sports team or a band, or in this case, a movie or a comic book. It was just a way of, self-expression that permeated and, just has become, I don't see it going back. I think it's
No.
always going to be there.
And again, as I'm saying, I think I'm young. So I was a nerd for liking superheroes beyond the age of 6 or 7 in the 90s. Like I even though they were part of the mainstream culture, I wouldn't talk about that with people at school that much beyond I guess elementary school. But you look at Batman 1989, and I think it predicted where we were going. That like superheroes are in the mainstream now. Like teenagers openly talk about collecting comics or what their favorite MCU movie is, or did you watch The Falcon and Winter Soldier last night? And it's just going to become socially acceptable. Like this is part of our fabric right now.
And I don't think it's going to be a long time before, if it hasn't already happened, where you don't even need to read the comic to enjoy the character, or
No.
you're like, oh, that's a comic. They've taken a life of their own by this point, and Batman in particular has kind of become like the new James Bond, where
absolutely,
just drop in whoever is and it almost is a way for actors who feel that they've been typecast to show that they're not, like, I'm not Laurie from Little Women, I'm Batman. I'm not
exactly,
the guy from Twilight and Harry Potter, I'm Batman. It's
and almost a chance for the directors to step outside of what we expect to do something. That when Pattinson was cast, I had that same thought. I was like, wait, the Twilight guy? And then I started thinking about it. I was like, oh wow, maybe this is like a Michael Keaton, like a director is deliberately breaking out of that archetype to do something new, which as a film goer is exciting. There's nothing worse than going and like knowing the movie before you even walk in and see it, like know exactly what it's going to be.
And it also matches the character of Bruce Wayne pretty well too, because of course he's hiding in plain sight. He's the last guy, this millionaire playboy is the last one that they're going to expect to be risking his life every night trying to, be a vigilante. So, I guess maybe that also feeds into why the people who are chosen for the character have been over the years,
exactly,
and continue to be. And so in that way, maybe Ben Affleck was the worst choice possible, because, I know we had that conversation when that movie was, when they indicated that one, that, he already was, and he'd already played a character very similar to Batman. In Daredevil.
I think he's a function though of that's a function of those films. That those films they're not trying to do anything subversively. It's just it's trying to envision it exactly as it is. And like I actually appreciate Ben Affleck's Batman. I think his Bruce Wayne is solid, but that's built on the fact that Ben Affleck is just like good looking, charming, and imposing. And I think he did a lot with those. I think physically he did a lot with that. But that's where the Pattinson and the Keaton, like that's where they shine. Where it's like Michael Keaton, no one, you watch any of his old movies before 1989 Batman, no one's like, oh yeah, this guy's gonna be an action star. But I think that Tim Burton saw in him like, oh man, this guy has some layers and depths that he can do. And it was, I think this movie was the movie where he threw that off. I think of Michael Keaton in the 90s as a whole, once you get out of the Batman franchise, he did some really risky and cool things. There's a movie he did called, oh god, I think it's called Extreme Measures with Andy Garcia, where he plays an escaped convict who's trying to like break out of a hospital, and he's very menacing and dangerous feeling. And if you like wound that back to Mr. Mom in whatever 1985 when that came out, it's like no one would say that about Michael Keaton in Gung Ho or Mr. Mom.
And don't forget Multiplicity. I mean, he actually did clone himself for that one. So I mean, he was
also a favorite movie of mine. Again, I know I'm opening myself up for a great deal of criticism, but I love that movie because Michael Keaton, I think untethered Michael Keaton is just endlessly watchable.
Well, I think that any criticism you receive would indicate that people are actually listening to this podcast. And so that's a wonderful thing for me.
Yeah.
And I think we did a nice job with this first one. I could have done it without you. If I did this myself, it would just be, it had been over probably about 50 minutes ago. And just be like, Batman is dark, and so were the late 1980s. But thank you so much for joining me on this venture, and hopefully this is not the last time. I plan on.
I'm always looking for an avenue to express my nerd knowledge. I'm not going to call her my long-suffering wife, but there's a breaking point where she has had enough of me talking for 50 straight minutes about, whatever comic I'm reading or what I realized. And she is a great companion for talking about that stuff, but I'm always looking for new avenues, especially with someone like you, who has such a unique perspective on things that you're willing to like disagree with the majority because you see something they don't. I always love that conversation. It really is a treat to take an hour or whatever, 80 minutes on my day just to talk about that stuff.
Well, and I think it was just a perfect way to really show, if there's any questions about 1989 Batman, I think we answered them. But absolutely. To show as an exemplar how something that, I mean, how many times have people walked past this in the video rental stores or, saw it, as they're flipping through the streaming, trying to find the Batman cartoon series and seeing this instead, where you don't think of it at all as just, it's just another Batman movie, but it is, just like every other primary source, a product of the time period in which it was made, and has contributed to the way that other pop culture and just society at large has gone on since then. So I thank you so much for joining me on this premiere episode of this, and I look forward to lots of more on the Everything is a Primary Source podcast, and we'll hopefully have you join us next time.
I'd absolutely, I'd be excited to do that. Thank you for having me.
Thank you again. Take care.
All right. You will.